Sarah Mitchell had always known she was different from other teachers. While her colleagues spent their weekends grading papers and planning lessons, she had once spent hers jumping out of helicopters and learning 17 different ways to disable an enemy in under 3 seconds. But those days were behind her now, or so she thought. The morning started like any other Tuesday at Roosevelt High School. Sarah arrived at 7:15 a.m., her military-precise timing unchanged even after 3 years of civilian life. She unlocked her classroom door, flipped on the fluorescent lights, and began arranging the day's materials on her desk: mathematics textbooks, worksheets, and a worn copy of Teaching Strategies for Difficult Students, a book she'd purchased but never quite finished reading. The hallways gradually filled with the familiar sounds of teenagers shuffling to their first period classes. Locker doors slammed, sneakers squeaked against polished floors, and voices carried the mix of excitement and dread that came with another school day. Sarah watched through her classroom window as students passed by, some eager, others clearly wishing they were anywhere else. Her first period advanced algebra class filtered in slowly. Most of these students knew her reputation. The teacher who never raised her voice but somehow commanded absolute respect. They'd heard rumors about her past, whispered stories about military service, but nothing concrete. Sarah preferred it that way. Her previous life as a Navy SEAL was not something she discussed, not even with her closest colleagues. "Good morning, everyone," Sarah said as the final bell rang. "Please take out yesterday's homework so we can review the problems together." The class proceeded smoothly. Sarah moved between the rows of desks, helping students who struggled with polynomial equations and praising those who had grasped the concepts quickly. This was why she'd left the military: the satisfaction of watching young minds grow, of helping teenagers realize their potential. It was a different kind of mission, but equally important. As first period ended and students packed their bags, Sarah noticed Marcus Thompson lingering by his desk. Marcus was a good student, quiet but intelligent, with aspirations of becoming an engineer. He approached her desk hesitantly. "Miss Mitchell, can I ask you something?" "Of course, Marcus. What's on your mind?" "It's about Jake Brennan. He's been bothering me again and I don't know what to do." Sarah's expression grew serious. Jake Brennan was a name she knew well. He was 18 years old, stood 6 feet 3 inches tall, and weighed close to 220 pounds. More importantly, he had a reputation that preceded him through the hallways like a dark cloud. Jake had been held back twice, making him older and bigger than most of his classmates. He'd been suspended multiple times for fighting, intimidation, and what the administration diplomatically called aggressive behavior toward faculty and students. His disciplinary file was thick enough to use as a doorstop, filled with incident reports, parent conferences, and failed intervention attempts. "What specifically has he been doing?" Sarah asked, keeping her voice calm despite the familiar stirring of protective instincts she thought she'd left behind. "Yesterday he cornered me by my locker and demanded my lunch money. When I said I didn't have any cash, he grabbed my backpack and dumped everything out. All my books, my papers, everything scattered across the floor." Marcus's voice wavered slightly. Other kids just walked by like nothing was happening.
"Nobody wants to get involved with Jake."
Sarah nodded thoughtfully. She'd heard similar stories from other students, always delivered in hushed tones and with nervous glances toward the door. Jake Brennan had created an atmosphere of fear that extended far beyond his immediate victims. "Have you reported this to the administration?" Marcus shook his head quickly. "That would just make it worse. Last time someone reported Jake, he found out who it was and that kid ended up in the hospital. Everyone knows you don't cross Jake Brennan." The second period bell rang, interrupting their conversation. Marcus gathered his books hurriedly. "I should go. Thanks for listening, Ms. Mitchell." As her second period class began filing in, Sarah noticed the change in atmosphere immediately. Students who had been chatting and laughing in the hallways grew subdued. Some glanced nervously toward the back corner of the room where Jake Brennan was taking his usual seat. Jake entered the classroom like he owned it. His swagger was unmistakable. Shoulders back, head high, eyes scanning the room for any sign of challenge. He wore the same worn leather jacket every day, despite the school's dress code, and his jeans had strategic rips that looked more calculated than accidental. His dark hair fell across his forehead in a way that might have been attractive if not for the permanent sneer that seemed etched into his features. Other students instinctively moved out of his path as he made his way to his desk. Sarah watched this subtle choreography with the trained eye of someone who had spent years reading crowd dynamics and threat assessments. Every student in the room was acutely aware of Jake's presence. Their body language shifted to avoid drawing his attention. "All right, let's begin today's lesson on quadratic functions," Sarah announced, turning to write on the whiteboard. As she explained the mathematical concepts, she was peripherally aware of Jake's behavior. He wasn't paying attention to the lesson, instead choosing to lean back in his chair and stare at the other students with an expression that could only be described as predatory. Occasionally, he would make a subtle gesture, a finger drawn across his throat, a mock punch thrown in someone's direction that caused his targets to flinch and look away. 20 minutes into the class, Jake grew bolder. He began making whispered comments to the students around him, none of whom dared to ignore him or ask him to stop. Sarah could see the fear in their eyes, the way they tried to shrink into their seats and become invisible. "Mr. Brennan," Sarah said without turning from the board, "do you have something you'd like to share with the class?" The room fell silent. Every student held their breath, knowing they were witnessing a moment that could go very badly. Jake wasn't used to being called out by teachers. Most had learned to look the other way, hoping to avoid confrontation. Jake's response was a low chuckle that sent chills through the room. "Just helping my classmates understand the lesson, Miss Mitchell, making sure they're paying attention." Sarah turned to face him, her expression neutral. "I appreciate your concern for your classmates' education. However, I think it would be more beneficial if you focused on your own understanding of the material." For a moment, the two stared at each other across the room. Other students later described feeling like they were watching a standoff between two gunfighters in an old Western movie. The tension was palpable, electric, dangerous. Jake's eyes narrowed slightly. He wasn't used to teachers who didn't immediately back down when challenged. Most faculty members at Roosevelt High had learned to manage Jake by avoiding direct confrontation, redirecting his attention, or simply ignoring his disruptive behavior. Sarah's calm, steady gaze was something new, and he didn't like it. "Sure thing, Teach," Jake finally said, his tone carrying just enough mockery to let everyone know this wasn't over. The rest of the period passed without further incident, but the atmosphere remained tense. When the bell rang, students filed out quickly, eager to escape the charged environment. Jake was among the last to leave, taking his time gathering his things while maintaining eye contact with Sarah. As he reached the door, he paused. "Interesting class, Ms. Mitchell. Real educational." After he left, Sarah took a deep breath and assessed what had just happened. In her military training, she'd learned to recognize different types of threats. Jake Brennan was what her instructors would have called a escalating hostile, someone whose behavior would continue to push boundaries until they encountered meaningful resistance. During her lunch break, Sarah decided to do some research. She accessed Jake's academic file through the school's computer system, reading through years of incident reports and behavioral assessments. The pattern was clear and troubling. Jake's problematic behavior had started in middle school with minor disruptions and had steadily escalated. He'd been involved in fights with students, verbal altercations with teachers, and had been suspended for bringing weapons to school on 2 separate occasions, once a knife, once brass knuckles. Each time he'd returned from suspension more defiant than before. The most concerning entries were the reports from female teachers and staff members. Several had requested not to have Jake in their classes after incidents of inappropriate comments, intimidation, and what one teacher had described as sexually aggressive behavior. Reading between the lines, Sarah could see that Jake had learned to target those he perceived as weak or vulnerable. What troubled Sarah most was the lack of meaningful consequences. Each incident had resulted in temporary suspensions, parent conferences, and strongly worded letters placed in his file. But Jake always returned, and his behavior always resumed. The system was failing, and everyone involved seemed to know it but felt powerless to change it. That afternoon, Sarah's final period of the day was her planning period. She used the time to prepare lessons and grade papers, but her mind kept returning to the morning's encounters with Marcus and Jake. As an educator, she felt responsible for creating a safe learning environment for all her students. As a former Navy SEAL, she recognized a threat that needed to be neutralized. The classroom was quiet except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sounds of after-school activities beginning in the gym. Sarah was deep in thought when she heard shouting from the hallway. She moved to her door and peered out to see Jake Brennan towering over a smaller student she recognized as David Chen, a sophomore in her third period class. "I told you to stay away from Emily," Jake was saying, his voice carrying clearly down the empty hallway. "She's mine, and if I catch you talking to her again, we're going to have problems." David was pressed against his locker, his face pale with fear. "I wasn't talking to her, Jake. We're just lab partners in chemistry. We have to work together." "Find a new partner," Jake snarled, placing his hand flat against the locker next to David's head. A sound echoed through the hallway like a gunshot. "Or I'll find you after school and explain it in a way you'll never forget." "Is everything all right out here?" Both students turned toward her. David's relief was visible, while Jake's expression shifted to barely contained annoyance. "Just having a friendly conversation, Ms. Mitchell," Jake said, not moving away from David. "Nothing to worry about." "David, don't you have chess club today?" Sarah asked, knowing full well that he did. David nodded eagerly, seeing his chance to escape. "Yes, ma'am. I should get going." "Excellent. I'll walk with you. I need to stop by the library anyway." As David hurried past Jake, Sarah fell into step beside him. She could feel Jake's eyes on her back, could sense his frustration at having his intimidation session interrupted. This was exactly the kind of behavior that had made Marcus afraid to report incidents, Jake's ability to corner students when they were alone and vulnerable. After dropping David off at chess club, Sarah returned to her classroom to finish her work. But her mind wasn't on lesson plans or grading. Instead, she found herself thinking about threat assessment protocols, about the way predators operated, about the difference between someone who talked tough and someone who was genuinely dangerous. Jake Brennan, she realized, was genuinely dangerous. His pattern of escalating behavior, his targeting of vulnerable individuals, and his apparent immunity to consequences had created a perfect storm. Someone was going to get hurt, and probably soon. As she packed her bag to leave for the day, Sarah made a decision. She would document everything she observed, report incidents when appropriate, and try to protect her students through proper channels. But she also began preparing for the possibility that proper channels might not be enough. That evening, in the quiet of her small apartment, Sarah found herself going through old military exercises in her mind, not because she wanted to use them, but because something told her that her past and present were about to collide in ways she'd never anticipated. The next morning would bring new challenges, and Sarah Mitchell, former Navy SEAL, current high school teacher, would need every skill she'd ever learned to protect her students and herself from a threat that was growing bolder by the day. The next morning brought an unusual tension to Roosevelt High School. Word had spread through the student grapevine that Miss Mitchell had stood up to Jake Brennan, and the hallways buzzed with whispered conversations and nervous energy. Students who had never paid much attention to their quiet math teacher now watched her with a mixture of admiration and concern. Sarah arrived at her usual time, but she immediately noticed something different. Several students lingered near her classroom door, ostensibly organizing their lockers or chatting with friends, but clearly positioning themselves where they could observe. She recognized the behavior from her military days. These kids were establishing a protective perimeter, though they probably didn't realize it themselves. "Good morning, Miss Mitchell," called out Amy Rodriguez, a senior who had never spoken to her before outside of class. "Good morning, Amy. How's your college application process going?" The girl's face lit up at the personal attention. "Really well, thanks for asking. I got accepted to state with a partial scholarship for engineering." "That's wonderful. Your hard work in mathematics is paying off." This exchange, innocent as it seemed, served multiple purposes. Amy was popular and well-respected among her peers. Her public, friendly interaction with Sarah was a subtle signal to other students about which side they should be on if tensions escalated. Sarah hadn't planned this strategic communication, but her years of reading social dynamics made her naturally aware of its importance. As first period began, Sarah noticed that Marcus Thompson seemed more relaxed than he had the previous day. He participated actively in class discussions and even volunteered to work through a problem on the board. When class ended, he approached her desk again. "Ms. Mitchell, I wanted to thank you for yesterday. Whatever you said to Jake, it worked. He hasn't bothered me at all." Sarah frowned slightly. She hadn't spoken directly to Jake about Marcus, which meant her intervention with David Chen had sent a broader message. This was both encouraging and concerning. Encouraging because it suggested Jake might respond to shows of authority, concerning because it meant he was definitely paying attention to her actions. I'm glad to hear that, Marcus. Remember, if anyone bothers you again, please let me know immediately. I will. And Mrs. Boston. Mitchell, a lot of us are really grateful that someone finally stood up to him. Nobody's ever done that before. As Marcus left, Sarah reflected on his words. The fact that nobody had ever stood up to Jake was part of the problem. Bullies like Jake thrived in environments where their targets felt isolated and authority figures seemed powerless or unwilling to intervene effectively. Second period arrived with its usual pre-Jake tension. Students filed in quietly, taking their seats and preparing for whatever drama might unfold. When Jake entered, Sarah was ready for him. She watched as he surveyed the room, noting the subtle changes in student behavior. They weren't cowering quite as much as usual. A few students even made brief eye contact with him before looking away, rather than immediately averting their gazes. The classroom dynamic was shifting, and Jake clearly didn't like it. Today we're going to work on solving systems of equations, Sarah announced, turning to write examples on the board. This is a skill you'll use not just in future math classes, but in real-world problem-solving situations. As she worked through the first example, she was acutely aware of Jake's presence behind her. Her military training had taught her to maintain situational awareness at all times, and she could feel his attention focused on her with laser-like intensity. When she turned back to face the class, his dark eyes were fixed on her with an expression she recognized from her years in hostile territory. Mr. Sarjay M. Hostele SAA. Brennan, would you like to try the next problem? Sarah asked, her tone pleasant but firm. The question caught Jake off guard. Teachers typically avoided putting him on the spot, knowing it could trigger an explosive reaction. His jaw tightened as he realized he was being challenged in front of his classmates. I don't think so, Teach. Math isn't really my thing. Everyone has strengths they haven't discovered yet. Give it a try. The room was silent except for the sound of the air conditioning and the distant noise of other classes in session. Students sensed they were witnessing something significant, though they couldn't quite define what. Jake's response was deliberate and calculated. He leaned back in his chair until it balanced on two legs, crossed his arms, and smiled coldly. I said no. Maybe you didn't hear me. Sarah set down her marker and turned to face him fully. Her posture was relaxed, her hands at her sides, her expression neutral. To most observers, she appeared calm and unthreatened. But Jake was seeing something else, a stillness that wasn't peaceful but predatory. I heard you perfectly well, Mr. Cromwell. Brennan, however, refusing to participate in class activities isn't an option. You can work through the problem at the board, or you can work through it at your desk and share your answer with the class. Either way, you'll be participating. Jake's chair came down hard against the floor. Several students flinched at the sound. Or what? You'll give me detention? Send me to the principal's office? We both know that's not going anywhere. He was right, and everyone in the room knew it. Jake's disciplinary history showed a pattern of administrators who seemed more interested in avoiding conflict than addressing problems. Detentions were ignored, suspensions were vacation days, and parent conferences resulted in his mother making excuses for behavior she couldn't or wouldn't control. Actually, Sarah said quietly, I was thinking more along the lines of helping you understand that cooperation makes everything easier for everyone involved. There was something in her tone that made Jake pause. It wasn't the pleading of teachers who begged him to comply, or the empty threats of administrators who had no real power over him. It was the calm certainty of someone who had dealt with much more dangerous opponents than an 18-year-old bully. For a moment, Jake seemed to consider backing down. Then his pride reasserted itself. He couldn't afford to look weak in front of his classmates, couldn't let a teacher, especially a female teacher, make him submit publicly. Cooperation? Jake laughed, but there was no humor in it. Lady, I think you've got the wrong idea about how things work around here. I do what I want, when I want, and nobody, including you, gets to tell me different. The challenge was now explicit and public. Every student in the room understood that they were witnessing a confrontation that would define the power structure of their classroom for the rest of the year. Some looked excited, others terrified, but all were completely focused on the drama unfolding before them. Sarah nodded thoughtfully, as if Jake had made a valid point worth considering. That's an interesting perspective, Jake. And you're right that you have choices about your behavior. But so do I, yeah? And what exactly are you going to do about it? Sarah smiled slightly. It wasn't a warm, friendly expression. It was the smile of someone who had just been given permission to solve a problem they'd been analyzing for some time. I'm going to teach. That's my job, and I'm very good at it. The question is whether you're going to learn or whether you're going to make things difficult for yourself and everyone else in this room. Jake stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. At his full height, he was intimidating. Taller than Sarah by several inches, broader, younger, and radiating the kind of physical menace that had made countless students and teachers back away from confrontation. Let me explain something to you, Teach. This is my classroom now. These kids listen to me, not you. And if you think you can change that by talking tough, you're about to learn a very painful lesson. He began walking toward the front of the room toward Sarah. Several students later reported that this was the moment when they realized something was seriously wrong. Jake's usual intimidation tactics involved getting close enough to his targets to invade their personal space, but he'd never done this to a teacher in front of a full classroom. Sarah didn't back away. She didn't reach for her phone to call for help. She didn't order Jake to return to his seat. Instead, she simply stood still and watched him approach, her expression unchanged. "Mr. Brennan," she said quietly, "I think you should reconsider what you're doing right now." Jake stopped about 3 feet away from her, close enough to emphasize their size difference, but not quite close enough for others to claim he'd been physically aggressive. It was a practiced move, one he'd used countless times to intimidate without quite crossing the line into assault. Or what? He repeated his earlier challenge. "What are you going to do to stop me?" The classroom was completely silent. Several students had pulled out their phones, whether to call for help or record what might happen next. Others sat frozen in their seats, afraid to move or speak or even breathe too loudly. Sarah looked up at Jake's face, studying his expression with the detached interest of a scientist examining a specimen. She saw anger there, yes, but also uncertainty. Jake was used to his physical presence being enough to end confrontations before they truly began. The fact that she wasn't backing down was outside his experience. "Jake," she said, her voice so quiet that students in the back row had to strain to hear her, "you're about to make a choice that you can't take back. I want you to think very carefully about what you do next." Something in her tone penetrated Jake's rage. For just a moment, he hesitated. In that moment of uncertainty, Sarah could see the 18-year-old boy beneath the bully's facade, someone who had probably learned to use intimidation and violence because nobody had ever taught him better ways to handle his emotions or get his needs met. But the moment passed. Jake's pride, his reputation, and his need to maintain dominance over his environment reasserted themselves. He took another step closer, now standing less than 2 feet away from Sarah. "I've thought about it," he said, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the room, "and I've decided that you need to learn some respect." What happened next would be debated and analyzed by students, faculty, and administrators for years to come. But in that moment, as Jake Brennan reached towards Sarah Mitchell with the intention of physically intimidating her into submission, he made a critical error in judgment. He assumed that because Sarah was smaller, older, and female, she would be helpless against his superior size and strength. He assumed that her calm demeanor indicated fear or weakness rather than preparation. Most importantly, he assumed that being a high school teacher meant she had never faced real danger before. All of these assumptions were about to be proven catastrophically wrong. Jake's hand moved toward Sarah's shoulder, intending to grab her and demonstrate his physical dominance. It was a move he'd used successfully on smaller students, a way of establishing control without technically throwing a punch. In his mind, this would be the moment when the new teacher learned her place in the school's power structure. Sarah watched his hand approach with the detached calm of someone who had spent years training for exactly this type of situation. Time seemed to slow as her military instincts activated, muscle memory overriding 3 years of civilian life. Her body prepared to respond to a threat, with the efficiency and precision that had been drilled into her through countless hours of combat training. But in that split second before contact, Sarah made a choice. Instead of immediately neutralizing the threat as her training demanded, she gave Jake one final warning. "Stop," she said simply. Jake's hand was inches from her shoulder when he heard the word. Something in her tone, the absolute certainty, the complete lack of fear, the unmistakable authority, made him pause again, but his momentum, both physical and emotional, carried him forward. His fingers brushed against the fabric of her blouse, and everything changed. The moment Jake's fingers made contact with Sarah's shoulder, something primitive and violent erupted inside him. Years of getting his way through intimidation, of watching teachers and students alike cower before his physical presence, had convinced him that he was untouchable. The fact that this quiet math teacher wasn't backing down felt like a personal insult that demanded immediate correction. "I warned you," Jake snarled, his grip tightening on Sarah's shoulder. But instead of the satisfying feeling of control he expected, something was wrong. Sarah wasn't pulling away or crying out. She wasn't pleading with him to stop or threatening to call the principal. She was just standing there, looking at him with those calm, steady eyes that seemed to see right through him. The classroom erupted in chaos. Students who had been watching in fascinated horror suddenly realized that their math teacher was being physically assaulted right in front of them. Some screamed, others pulled out phones to call 911, and several of the braver boys started to get up from their seats, though none of them were quite sure what they could do against someone of Jake's size and reputation. "Somebody get help!" shouted Jennifer Walsh from the back row. "Get Mr. Peterson! Get security!" But even as students scrambled to find adult help, they couldn't look away from what was happening at the front of the room. There was something about Sarah's complete stillness that was more terrifying than Jake's aggression. She looked like a coiled spring, like a predator waiting for exactly the right moment to strike. Jake, high on adrenaline and convinced of his own superiority, interpreted Sarah's lack of resistance as submission. This was how it always went: a show of force, followed by immediate compliance. Teachers and students alike had learned that it was easier to give Jake what he wanted than to fight him. "That's better," he said, his voice loud enough for the entire class to hear. "Now maybe you'll remember who's really in charge here." But instead of the cowering compliance he expected, Sarah did something that shocked everyone in the room. She smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile or a nervous one. It was the smile of someone who had just watched their opponent make a crucial mistake. In that moment, every student in the classroom got a glimpse of who Sarah Mitchell really was, beneath her quiet teacher exterior. "Jake," she said conversationally, as if they were discussing weekend plans rather than standing in the middle of a physical confrontation. "Do you know what the most important thing I learned in the Navy was?" The question was so unexpected that Jake's grip on her shoulder loosened slightly. "What are you talking about?" "Threat assessment," Sarah continued in that same calm tone. "The ability to quickly evaluate a dangerous situation and respond appropriately. For instance, right now I'm assessing you." Students later said that the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. There was something in Sarah's voice that made everyone suddenly realize that they were witnessing something far more dangerous than a simple confrontation between a bully and a teacher. Jake's confusion was evident on his face. This wasn't going according to script. Teachers were supposed to be afraid of him not calmly discussing military training while he had his hands on them. "You're crazy," he said, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. "Am I? Let's see. You're 18 years old, approximately 6'3", probably 220 pounds. You're used to using your size to intimidate people who can't or won't fight back. You've probably never faced real resistance before, certainly never from someone with actual combat training." As Sarah spoke, Jake became increasingly uncomfortable. Something about her tone, her posture, her complete lack of fear was triggering alarms in the primitive part of his brain that recognized genuine danger. "Combat training?" Jake tried to laugh, but it came out hollow and forced. "Lady, you're a math teacher." "I'm a lot of things," Sarah replied quietly. "And right now, I'm giving you one last chance to remove your hand from my shoulder and return to your seat." The classroom was silent except for the sound of heavy breathing and the distant noise of normal school activities continuing in other parts of the building. Students sat frozen, afraid to move or speak, sensing that they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come. Jake's pride warred with a growing sense that he had made a serious miscalculation. But backing down now in front of all these students would destroy his reputation and his power over them. He couldn't afford to look weak. Instead of removing his hand, Jake did something that crossed a line from simple intimidation into genuine assault. His fingers moved from Sarah's shoulder to her throat. "Maybe you didn't hear me clearly," he said, applying pressure. "I told you that you need to learn some respect." The chokehold was clumsy and amateurish, the kind of move someone might see in a movie and think they understood. Jake had obviously never received any real training in how to properly restrain someone, which made his actions both less effective and more dangerous. He could easily crush Sarah's windpipe by accident, or cause serious injury through ignorance of proper technique. But the moment Jake's hand closed around Sarah's throat, everything changed. The transformation was so sudden and complete that several students later described it as watching a different person inhabit Sarah's body. Her calm teacher demeanor vanished, replaced by something cold, efficient, and absolutely lethal. Sarah's right hand moved with impossible speed and precision. Her fingers found the pressure point on Jake's wrist, applying exactly the right amount of force in exactly the right location to cause his grip to involuntarily release. Simultaneously, her left hand struck upward, not at Jake's face or throat, but at his elbow, hyperextending his arm and causing him to stumble forward. The entire sequence took less than 2 seconds. Jake found himself bent forward at an awkward angle, his right arm twisted behind his back in a position that was uncomfortable but not quite painful enough to cause permanent damage. Sarah stood behind him, one hand maintaining control of his wrist, the other resting lightly on his shoulder in a way that somehow conveyed absolute dominance. "This is called a compliance hold," Sarah explained to the stunned classroom, her voice returning to its normal teaching tone as if nothing unusual had happened. "It's designed to control an aggressive subject without causing unnecessary injury." Jake tried to struggle, but every movement only increased his discomfort and demonstrated how completely helpless he was. Sarah's grip was like iron, precisely applied and impossible to break through brute force. "Let me go!" Jake shouted, but there was panic in his voice now rather than anger. For the first time in his life, he was completely at someone else's mercy, and he didn't like the feeling. In a moment, Sarah said calmly, "But first, I think we need to establish some ground rules for future interactions." The students watched in fascinated silence as their quiet math teacher maintained perfect control over the school's most feared bully. Some were recording on their phones, others were still calling for help, but all were riveted by what they were witnessing. "You see," Sarah continued, adjusting her grip slightly to emphasize her point, "respect isn't something you can take by force. It's something you earn through your actions. Right now, your actions are showing everyone in this room exactly what kind of person you really are." Jake's face was red with embarrassment and rage. Being dominated by anyone was humiliating, but being controlled so effortlessly by a woman half his size in front of his classmates was devastating to his carefully constructed image of invincibility. "This is assault!" he gasped. "You can't do this to a student." "Actually," Sarah replied with academic precision, "you committed assault when you put your hands on me without permission. What I'm doing now is defending myself and protecting the other students in this classroom from a clear threat." The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Jake, who had spent years terrorizing smaller, weaker targets, was now experiencing what it felt like to be completely powerless in the face of superior skill and strength. "Now," Sarah said, "I'm going to release you. When I do, you're going to walk calmly to your seat, sit down, and we're going to finish today's lesson. Are we clear?" Jake nodded reluctantly, having little choice in the matter. Sarah slowly released her hold, stepping back to give him room while remaining ready to respond if he tried anything stupid. For a moment, Jake stood rubbing his wrist and staring at Sarah with a mixture of shock, rage, and something that might have been respect. The confident swagger that had defined his presence in the classroom was gone, replaced by the uncertain posture of someone who had just discovered that the world was much more dangerous than he'd believed. "How did you—" he started to ask, then stopped himself. 12 years in the Navy," Sarah said simply. 4 years as a SEAL. I've faced enemies who were bigger, stronger, and much better trained than you. The difference is, they were actually dangerous." The revelation hit the classroom like a physical blow. Students stared at their math teacher with new understanding, finally making sense of her unshakable calm, her perfect posture, her way of moving through the world like someone who had seen real danger and survived it. Jake, meanwhile, was processing the fact that he had just tried to physically intimidate a former Navy SEAL. In his limited understanding of military hierarchies, he knew that SEALs were elite warriors, the kind of people who appeared in action movies and news reports about dangerous missions in foreign countries. "You're really," he began. "Yes. And now you know why I wasn't impressed by your little intimidation routine." Sarah's tone was matter-of-fact, neither boastful nor apologetic. "You've been playing at being tough with children and civilians who couldn't fight back. I've fought actual enemies who were trying to kill me." The distinction was crystal clear to everyone in the room. Jake's bullying tactics, which had seemed so threatening and powerful just minutes before, now looked childish and pathetic in comparison to real violence and real danger. Jake slowly walked back to his seat, moving carefully as if afraid that sudden movements might trigger another demonstration of Sarah's capabilities. As he sat down, the entire dynamic of the classroom shifted. Students who had been afraid to make eye contact with him now watched him with curious detachment, as if seeing him clearly for the first time. "Now then," Sarah said, turning back to the whiteboard as if nothing unusual had happened, "let's continue with our lesson on systems of equations. Jake, since you didn't get a chance to work the previous problem, would you like to try this one?" The question was delivered in the same pleasant teaching tone she'd used before the confrontation, but now it carried undertones that everyone in the room understood. This wasn't really a request. Jake looked at the equation on the board, then at Sarah, then at his classmates who were watching him with expressions ranging from sympathy to amusement. For the first time in years, he was in a position where cooperation was clearly his best option. "Sure," he said quietly, and began working through the problem. As he solved the equation step by careful step, something remarkable happened. Without his usual aggressive posturing and intimidation tactics, Jake revealed himself to be reasonably intelligent. He understood the mathematical concepts and was able to apply them correctly. When he finished, several students actually nodded approvingly at his work. "Excellent," Sarah said warmly. "See? I told you that everyone has strengths they haven't discovered yet." The remainder of the class period passed peacefully. Students participated in discussions, worked through problems, and asked questions without the undercurrent of fear that had dominated previous sessions. Jake remained quiet but engaged, occasionally answering questions when called upon but making no attempt to disrupt or intimidate. When the bell rang, students gathered their belongings slowly, reluctant to leave the scene of such a dramatic transformation. As they filed out, many paused to speak with Sarah. "That was amazing, Mitchell," whispered Amy Rodriguez. "I can't believe you're really a Navy SEAL." "Former SEAL," Sarah corrected gently. "Now I'm just a teacher who wants her students to learn in a safe environment." Jake was among the last to leave. As he reached the door, he paused and looked back at Sarah. The expression on his face was complex, part embarrassment, part respect, part confusion about how his world had just been turned upside down. "Miss Mitchell," he said quietly, sorry about earlier." Sarah nodded acknowledgement. Apology accepted, Jake. "Tomorrow is a fresh start for all of us." After he left, Sarah sat down at her desk and took a deep breath. She hadn't wanted to reveal her military background, hadn't wanted to resort to physical force. But sometimes, she reflected, the only way to deal with a bully was to demonstrate that their tactics wouldn't work on you. The real test, she knew, would be what happened next. Word of the confrontation would spread throughout the school within hours. How Jake responded to his very public defeat would determine whether this incident marked the beginning of positive change or simply escalated the conflict to a new level. Word of the confrontation spread through Roosevelt High School like wildfire. By lunchtime, every student in the building had heard some version of the story about how Ms. Mitchell, the quiet math teacher, had taken down Jake Brennan using military combat techniques. The details varied with each telling. Some claimed she'd thrown him across the room. Others insisted she'd held him in a chokehold until he passed out. But the core facts remained consistent. Jake Brennan, the school's most feared bully, had been completely and effortlessly dominated by a woman half his size. Sarah spent her lunch period in her classroom, grading papers and trying to process what had happened. She'd known that revealing her military background would change how people saw her, but she hadn't anticipated the intensity of the reaction. Students kept finding excuses to walk past her classroom, peering in with curious and admiring glances. Several teachers had stopped by to ask if the rumors were true. "So it's really happening," said Margaret Chen, the school's librarian, and one of Sarah's few close colleagues. Jake Brennan finally met his match. Margaret was a small, energetic woman in her 50s who had taught at Roosevelt for over 20 years. She'd seen countless students come and go, including several who reminded her uncomfortably of Jake, but she'd never seen anyone handle a situation quite like Sarah had. "I didn't want it to come to that," Sarah said, setting down her red pen. "I was hoping to find a way to reach him without having to resort to physical intervention." "Sometimes there isn't another way," Margaret replied pragmatically. "Some people only understand force. The question is, what happens now?" It was a good question, and one that Sarah had been pondering all morning. In her military experience, decisive action usually ended conflicts quickly and permanently. Enemies who understood they were outmatched either retreated or sought accommodation. But high school social dynamics were more complex than battlefield tactics. Her afternoon classes proceeded normally, though she could sense the undercurrent of excitement among students who had heard about the morning's events. Many seemed more engaged than usual, participating in discussions with an energy that suggested they felt safer and more confident in her presence. But it was during her final period planning time that Sarah received an unexpected visitor. Principal Robert Hayes knocked on her classroom door, his expression serious and somewhat uncomfortable. Principal Hayes was a well-meaning administrator who genuinely cared about his students, but he was also someone who preferred to avoid conflict whenever possible. In his 15 years at Roosevelt, he'd learned to manage problems like Jake Brennan through a combination of suspension, parent conferences, and strategic scheduling designed to minimize opportunities for trouble. "Sarah, we need to talk," he said, closing the door behind him. "I imagine we do. Have a seat." Principal Hayes settled into one of the student desks, his tall frame looking awkward in the small chair. He was clearly struggling with how to begin the conversation. "I've been getting phone calls all afternoon," he said finally. "Parents, school board members, even some local media outlets. Everyone wants to know about the incident with Jake Brennan this morning." Sarah nodded. She'd expected this conversation, though she'd hoped it might be delayed until she'd had more time to think through her approach. "What exactly did they tell you happened?" "The stories vary, but the consensus seems to be that Jake physically assaulted you and you defended yourself using military techniques. Is that accurate?" "Essentially, yes. Jake grabbed my shoulder, then put his hand around my throat. I used a standard compliance hold to control the situation and prevent further escalation." Principal Hayes rubbed his temples, a gesture that suggested this conversation was giving him a significant headache. "Sarah, I need you to understand the position this puts me in. We have strict policies about physical contact between faculty and students, regardless of the circumstances. Even when the faculty member is being assaulted? That's what makes this so complicated. Under normal circumstances, we would expect a teacher to call for help, evacuate other students, or use other de-escalation techniques. We don't expect teachers to physically subdue students, no matter how justified it might seem." Sarah leaned back in her chair, studying the principal's face. She could see his dilemma. He was trapped between administrative policies designed for normal situations and the reality of dealing with someone like Jake Brennan. "Bob," she said, using his first name to remind him that they were colleagues as well as administrator and employee, "how many teachers has Jake intimidated over the years? How many students has he terrorized? How many incidents have been reported, and how many have actually been resolved?" The principal's silence was answer enough. They both knew that Jake's behavior had been escalating for years, while the school's response had been largely ineffective. "I understand your position," Sarah continued, "but you need to understand mine. I didn't wake up this morning planning to have a physical confrontation with a student, but when that student put his hands on me in an aggressive manner, I responded with the minimum force necessary to protect myself and the other students in my classroom. But Sarah, you're a trained Navy SEAL. You could have seriously injured Jake with those techniques." "That's exactly why I didn't seriously injure him," Sarah replied calmly. My training taught me how to control a situation without causing permanent damage. If I had been an untrained person facing the same threat, someone might have gotten badly hurt. Principal Hayes considered this perspective. He'd seen the results of fights involving Jake before students with black eyes, bloody noses, and in one case, a broken wrist. The fact that Jake had walked away from his confrontation with Sarah without so much as a bruise suggested that her response had been remarkably restrained. "There's another issue," the principal said reluctantly. "Jake's mother is demanding that you be fired. She's threatening to sue the school district for assault and civil rights violations." Sarah almost smiled at this. Jake's mother has been making excuses for his behavior and threatening lawsuits for years. How has that worked out for the school so far? Not well, the principal admitted. But this time might be different. She's claiming that you used excessive force against her son and there were witnesses. There were indeed witnesses. 26 students who saw Jake grab me and put his hand around my throat before I defended myself. Those same students saw me use the minimum force necessary to control the situation, then immediately return to teaching. If Mrs. Brennan wants to take this to court, I'm confident that the evidence will support my actions. The principal nodded slowly. He'd reviewed the statements from students who had been in the classroom, and they were remarkably consistent. Every single witness confirmed that Jake had initiated physical contact and that Sarah's response had been measured and professional. What about the media attention? This story is starting to get picked up by news outlets. Navy SEAL teacher subdues school bully is apparently an irresistible headline. Sarah shrugged. I can't control media coverage, but I can control my response to it. I acted appropriately to protect myself and my students. If that generates positive attention for the school's commitment to safety, then perhaps some good can come from an unfortunate situation. As they talked, both Sarah and Principal Hayes became aware of a change in the atmosphere outside the classroom. The usual after-school noise of students gathering belongings and heading home had been replaced by something more subdued but more intense. Voices carried down the hallway, but they were quieter than usual, more focused. Principal Hayes moved to the window and looked out at the courtyard where students typically gathered before heading home. What he saw made him pause. "Sarah, you should see this." Sarah joined him at the window. In the courtyard below, groups of students were clustered together in animated conversation. But instead of the usual random social groupings, there seemed to be a different organization to the crowd. Students who rarely interacted were talking together, sharing stories and comparing experiences. They're talking about Jake, Sarah realized, about all the things he's done over the years. For the first time, students felt safe enough to openly discuss their experiences with Jake Brennan's bullying. Stories that had been whispered in private or never shared at all were being told openly. The psychological barrier that had kept Jake's victims isolated and silent had been broken. "Look there," Principal Hayes pointed toward a bench where Marcus Thompson sat, surrounded by several other students. Marcus was speaking animatedly, his hands gesturing as he described something. The students around him were nodding and responding with their own stories. "That's David Chen," Sarah noted, recognizing the boy Jake had cornered by his locker the previous day. "And Amy Rodriguez, Jennifer Walsh, these are kids who never would have talked to each other before." What they were witnessing was something unprecedented at Roosevelt High School. Jake Brennan's former victims were connecting with each other, sharing their experiences, and realizing that they weren't alone. The fear and isolation that had made Jake's bullying so effective was dissolving into community and mutual support. "This changes things," Principal Hayes said quietly. As they watched, another figure appeared in the courtyard. Jake Brennan walked slowly across the space, his usual confident stride replaced by something more uncertain. Students who would have normally scattered at his approach instead watched him with curious detachment. Some continued their conversations as if he wasn't there at all. Jake seemed lost, unsure of how to navigate a social environment where his intimidation tactics no longer worked. He approached a group of younger students who had typically been easy targets, but instead of the fear he expected to see, he was met with polite but uninterested expressions. "Excuse me," one of the younger students said calmly, stepping around Jake to join his friends. The dismissal was so matter-of-fact, so completely without drama or fear, that it was more devastating than any confrontation could have been. Jake stood alone in the middle of the courtyard, perhaps for the first time in his high school career, truly understanding what isolation felt like. "We need to help him," Sarah said suddenly. Principal Hayes looked at her in surprise. "Help Jake? After what he put you through?" "Especially after what he put me through." Jake didn't become a bully in a vacuum. He learned these behaviors somewhere, and he's been using them because they've been effective. Now that they're not working anymore, he's going to need to learn new ways of interacting with people. Sarah's perspective was informed by her military experience, where enemies could sometimes become allies if the underlying conflicts were addressed. But it was also informed by her training as an educator, which had taught her that every student deserved the opportunity to change and grow. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that we use this opportunity to help Jake understand that he has choices about how he treats people. Right now, he's experiencing what it feels like to be powerless and isolated. That's exactly the feeling he's been inflicting on other students for years." As they continued to watch, Jake's isolation became more pronounced. Students weren't actively avoiding him or being cruel. They were simply treating him like any other person, rather than as someone to be feared. For someone who had built his entire identity around being intimidating, this indifference was devastating. "I should go talk to him," Sarah said. "Are you sure that's wise?" After this morning, Jake was operating from a position of perceived strength. Right now, he's vulnerable and confused. Sometimes that's when real learning can happen. Sarah left the principal in her classroom and made her way down to the courtyard. As she approached Jake, she could see the conflict playing out across his face. Pride warring with uncertainty, anger mixing with something that might have been fear. "Jake," she said simply, "how are you doing?" He looked at her suspiciously, as if waiting for some kind of trap or trick. "I'm fine. You don't look fine. You look like someone who's having his world turned upside down." Jake's jaw tightened, but he didn't deny her observation. Around them, other students continued their conversations while occasionally glancing their way with curiosity. "I don't understand what's happening," he said finally. "Everything's different now." "Yes, it is. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" Sarah's tone wasn't judgmental or threatening. It was the same calm, steady voice she used when helping students work through difficult mathematical concepts. She was presenting Jake with a problem to solve, not a punishment to endure. "I don't know," Jake admitted. "I don't know how to be around people when they're not afraid of me." It was perhaps the most honest thing Jake had said in years. His admission revealed the fundamental insecurity that had driven his bullying behavior, a deep fear that if people weren't afraid of him, they would reject him entirely. "Would you like to learn?" Sarah asked. Jake looked at her with surprise. After everything that had happened between them, she was offering to help him rather than seeking revenge or punishment. "Why would you want to help me?" "Because that's what teachers do," Sarah said simply. "We help students learn new things. And right now, you need to learn how to build relationships based on respect rather than fear." As the sun began to set over Roosevelt High School, a new chapter was beginning. Jake Brennan's reign of terror was over, but, more importantly, the healing process was just beginning. Students were connecting with each other in new ways, sharing their experiences and supporting one another. And perhaps most remarkably, the person who had ended Jake's bullying was now offering to help him become something better. The transformation wouldn't happen overnight. Change never does, especially for someone like Jake, who had spent years building his identity around intimidation and aggression. But for the first time in his life, he had a choice about who he wanted to become. And standing beside him, ready to help him make better choices, was a former Navy SEAL who had learned that sometimes the most difficult battles are fought not with weapons, but with patience, understanding, and the belief that people can change. In the months that followed, Roosevelt High School became a different place. Students reported feeling safer, more connected, and more willing to speak up when they saw problems. Jake Brennan, with Sarah's guidance and the school's support, slowly learned new ways of relating to his classmates. It wasn't easy, and there were setbacks along the way, but the fundamental dynamic had shifted. The story of the day a Navy SEAL shut down a school bully became legend at Roosevelt High School. But the real story, the one about how one teacher's courage created an opportunity for an entire community to heal and grow, was still being written, one day at a time.